The bitter wind carried the acrid smell of defeat through the open balcony in Shalar's capital. Emily stood with her spine rigid and her jaw clenched so tightly that pain radiated through her temples. Her long black braids swayed slightly in the breeze as she looked down at the central square that once represented the pride and achievement of her people. Her blue skin, traditionally a mark of nobility and strength among her species, now seemed only to designate her as something conquered and subjugated. Below, her people moved with downcast eyes under the watchful gaze of human soldiers, their movements restrained and submissive. Emily's fingers curled into tight fists at her sides, her nails digging crescents into her palms, deep enough to draw tiny beads of indigo blood. Heavy footsteps approached from behind, the familiar cadence unmistakable even through her grief. She maintained her position, refusing to acknowledge the presence immediately. It was her father, the deposed chieftain, once the most powerful leader their clan had known in 7 generations. He stood beside her in waited silence, his large hand coming to rest on her shoulder. The gesture contained more meaning than 1,000 words. His eyes, when she finally turned to meet them, conveyed everything: resignation, sorrow, and the unbearable weight of necessity. They had no choice left, not if their people were to survive. "The ceremony will be tomorrow at first light," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse, the tone of a leader who had spent days negotiating the terms of his own people's surrender. "The human commander insists that this union will solidify the peace between our worlds. He claims it is the only way to ensure our cultural survival." "Peace," Emily repeated, the word dissolving like ash on her tongue, bitter and choking. What a convenient term they use for what should rightfully be called submission. They invade our lands, destroy our defensive capabilities, and then demand our gratitude when they graciously allow us to continue breathing. Her father's fingers tightened on her shoulder, a warning pressure that she recognized from childhood. "Control your anger, daughter. The walls have ears, and sentiment like that could jeopardize everything we have worked to preserve." "What have we preserved, father?" Emily challenged, turning to face him fully. The setting sun cast harsh shadows across his once proud features, now lined with exhaustion and defeat. "Our buildings stand empty. Our sacred groves burn. Our people labor under armed guards. What exactly should I be grateful for preserving?" Her father's expression hardened, though pain flickered behind his eyes. "Our lives, Emily. Our future. The chance for our children to grow up without knowing war." He took her shoulders in both hands now, his grip almost painfully tight. "This is not the end of our people. It is a transition. We have survived invasions before. We adapt, we endure, and eventually we thrive again. But first, we must survive." Emily wanted to argue further, but the desperate hope in her father's eyes silenced her. This proud man, who had taught her to stand tall against any threat, was now pleading with her to bend. She recognized what this cost him. "Tomorrow you will marry the human warrior they have chosen," he continued, his voice dropping even lower. "He is not just any soldier. He is their most effective killer, the one they deployed when conventional forces failed. They call him their specialist, but our scouts reported differently. They say he moves like death itself." A cold dread settled in Emily's stomach. Why would they choose such a man for this arrangement? "Because they fear us still," her father replied, a ghost of pride flickering across his features. "They believe pairing you with their deadliest weapon will ensure our continued cooperation. It is both an insult and, strangely, a compliment." Emily turned back to the balcony, staring out at the dying day. "Then I am to be both bride and hostage. You are to be the bridge, daughter, the connection between what was and what will be." He paused, then added more softly, "And perhaps, someday, the instrument of our resurgence." Emily understood the unspoken message beneath his words. This was not just about survival, it was about playing a longer game than their conquerors could imagine. She nodded once, accepting the burden that was now hers to carry. "I will do my duty," she said, the words tasting like surrender. When her father left, Emily remained on the balcony until the 3 moons rose, casting their pale light over the conquered city. She thought of the Shilom warriors who had died defending their territory, including her 2 older brothers. The eldest, Tarek, had fallen in the first wave of human attacks, his transport shot down before it even reached the battlefield. The second, Nareem, had led the final defense of the capital before disappearing during the chaotic evacuation. Some claimed he had escaped to the mountains to lead the resistance. Others whispered that he had been captured and executed. Either way, he was lost to her, leaving Emily as the sole surviving child of the once mighty Chief Ziran. The irony wasn't lost on her. In Shi'Lar culture, daughters traditionally maintained diplomatic relations while sons commanded military forces. Emily had broken tradition by attending the war college alongside her brothers, mastering not just diplomacy, but combat tactics. Her father had indulged her unusual interests, perhaps foreseeing a time when such knowledge might prove valuable. Now she was the only one left to employ those skills, not on the battlefield, but in the most intimate form of diplomacy imaginable. She touched the ceremonial dagger hidden within her robes, a blade passed down through generations of Shi'Lar nobility. Tradition demanded she bring it to her marriage ceremony, symbolizing her ability to defend her new household. The humans, with their limited understanding of Shi'Lar customs, had allowed this concession without recognizing its deeper significance. The blade was more than ceremonial. It was razor-sharp and poison-tipped, designed for a single lethal strike. Emily had considered using it on her unwanted human husband during the ceremony. One quick movement, one moment of surprise, and she could eliminate the most dangerous human weapon before anyone could react. Her own life would be forfeit, but her death might reignite the Shi'Lar resistance, showing that even in defeat, they remained deadly. But her father's words echoed in her mind. Survival first, adaptation. The long game. With reluctant resolve, Emily removed the dagger from its hidden pocket and placed it in a decorative box, locking away both the weapon and the impulse it represented. She would play her role, endure this human marriage, and wait for an opportunity that served more than her desire for vengeance. The true victory would come not from a single dramatic act of defiance, but from patient, calculated survival. As the night deepened around her, Emily began the ancient Shi'Lar breathing rituals, preparing herself mentally for what lay ahead. She would meet this human weapon, this ghost who kills, not with fear, but with the composed dignity of her lineage. Let him see not a defeated princess, but a worthy adversary disguised as a compliant bride. Let him underestimate her, as humans always underestimated the Shi'Lar women. By morning, her resolve had hardened into something unbreakable. She would survive this. She would endure. And someday, when the moment was right, the humans would discover just how dangerous a Shi'Lar bride could be. On the opposite side of the settlement, far from the elegant spires of the Shi'Lar capital, Colin moved with deadly precision across the training ground of the human outpost. The combat knife in his hand caught the waning sunlight as he executed a series of strikes against the practice dummy. Each movement flowed into the next with mathematical precision. No wasted energy, no flourish, nothing but pure lethal intent translated into physical form. Sweat gleamed on his skin despite the cooling evening air, but his breathing remained measured and controlled, as though his body functioned on different principles than ordinary men. Around the perimeter of the training area, other soldiers maintained their distance, watching with expressions that mixed professional admiration with primitive fear. None approached or offered to spar. Colin was technically of the same rank as many of them, but everyone understood the distinction. Where they were soldiers following orders, Colin was something else entirely, a weapon given human form, deployed when ordinary military solutions proved inadequate. His reputation had spread quickly after the Battle of the Southern Ridge, where Shi'Lar forces had successfully repelled 3 waves of conventional attacks. Command had sent Colin in alone under cover of darkness. By dawn, the Shi'Lar defensive line had collapsed, their commander's severed head displayed on their own standard. The official reports cited coordinated special operations, but the troops knew better. One man had broken what an army could not. The soldiers who witnessed Colin's return from that mission still spoke of it in hushed tones. He had walked through the camp at sunrise, covered in dried blue blood that was not his own, carrying nothing but his combat knife and a small pouch containing intelligence documents. His uniform had been shredded in dozens of places, evidence of close-quarter combat with multiple opponents, yet he bore only minor wounds. When the commanding officer debriefed him, Colin had delivered his report with the same flat effect he might use to describe routine patrol duty, despite having single-handedly infiltrated and dismantled the Shi'Lar command structure. That incident cemented Colin's reputation among both human forces and the Shi'Lar. To humans, he was their most effective asset, a strategic advantage that turned hopeless situations into victories. To the Shilar, he became something approaching a mythological figure, a shadow demon who struck without warning and disappeared just as quickly. They called him the ghost who kills, and mothers used his name to frighten disobedient children. Few knew his actual appearance. Fewer still had seen him and survived. It was this reputation that made him the perfect symbolic choice for the marriage alliance. The Shilar would understand the implied threat. Continued resistance would unleash this human weapon upon them again. The marriage wouldn't just be political, it would be psychological warfare dressed in diplomatic clothing. Kennedy, a voice called out, breaking the hypnotic rhythm of his practice. Colin halted mid-strike, the knife held perfectly steady as though frozen in time. Sir, no wasted movement, not even to turn and acknowledge the speaker. Commander Hayes approached, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust as he crossed the hard-packed earth. A veteran of 3 interplanetary campaigns, he was one of the few officers who addressed Colin directly rather than through handlers. Tomorrow's the day, the ceremony with the chieftain's daughter. Colin nodded once, his expression unchanging. He wiped down his blade methodically before sheathing it at his hip. You've reviewed the file on her? Hayes asked, studying Colin's face for any reaction. Emily Shilar, age equivalent to human 26, educated in their traditional war college and in governance, proficient in 3 dialects, participated in 4 defensive campaigns against our forces, suspected of coordinating the ambush at Sector 7 that resulted in 17 human casualties. Colin recited the facts with the same detachment as he might read a weapons specification. Hayes nodded slowly. That's the official intelligence, yes, but there's more to understanding a person than memorizing their dossier, especially someone you're expected to cohabitate with. Colin finally turned to face the commander fully. You're concerned about my ability to maintain the arrangement. I'm concerned that you understand the importance of this union beyond tactical advantage. It's not just political theater. We need the Shilar compliant and cooperative for resource extraction to proceed on schedule. This marriage needs to at least appear functional. I understand the mission parameters, sir. The appearance of a successful integration will help pacify the remaining resistance cells. Hayes studied him for a long moment, then sighed, a sound of resignation rather than disappointment. I'm sure you do understand the parameters. Just remember, she's not a target or an assignment. According to their customs and ours, she'll be your wife. That means something different than an operational directive. Colin returned his gaze steadily, his eyes revealing nothing. Is there anything else, sir? Hayes shook his head. No, dismissed. As Colin turned to leave, Hayes added, and Kennedy, try not to look at her the way you look at everything else, like you're calculating the fastest way to take it apart. Colin paused briefly but did not respond before walking away. That night, Colin sat alone in his quarters, reviewing the detailed file on Emily Shilar for the 6th time. The sparse room contained nothing personal, standard issue furnishings, undecorated walls, everything arranged with mathematical precision. He studied the images of his soon-to-be wife with the same clinical detachment he applied to topographical maps before an insertion mission. The Shilar were humanoid enough that interbreeding was theoretically possible, though genetic compatibility required medical intervention. Their blue skin ranged from pale azure to deep indigo, depending on regional adaptation. Emily's was the color of Earth's evening sky just after sunset, a detail Colin noted objectively, the way he might observe that a particular weapon was manufactured from a specific alloy. A notification flashed on his tablet. New intelligence, intercepts suggesting increased Tsar activity in the outer territories. The primitive yet dangerous indigenous predator species had been unusually aggressive in recent months, attacking both human and Shilar settlements with greater coordination than previously documented. Colin absorbed this information, filing it away as potentially relevant. The Tsar represented a variable in the equation, a common enemy that might serve as leverage to strengthen the forced alliance. He set the tablet aside and performed his nightly conditioning routine. 100 precision push-ups, 100 sit-ups, tension exercises for each muscle group. The physical regimen was as much about control as fitness. Control was everything. Control meant survival. Control meant mission success. Tomorrow he would take a wife. The concept was foreign to him, but he approached it like any other assignment. Identify the objective. Assess the obstacles. Execute with precision. Adapt as necessary to changing conditions. Sleep came to him as it always did, immediately upon decision, another function of control. The ceremonial hall loomed cavernous and austere, its high ceiling lost in shadow. No decorations adorned the stark walls, no music filled the still air. Officials from both sides stood in rigid lines, faces carefully blank as they observed the proceedings with calculated disinterest. The marriage ritual had been stripped to its barest elements. No celebration, just procedure, a treaty enacted through two bodies. Emily and Colin stood facing each other beneath the hall's central dome, her gaze fixed deliberately on a point beyond his shoulder, refusing to acknowledge the man she was being bound to for what would likely be the remainder of her life. Her blue skin appeared almost ashen in the harsh lighting. Her slender body held tense beneath the ceremonial robes that had been passed down through generations of her family for happier unions. The garments that should have symbolized joyous continuation of her bloodline now felt like burial shrouds. Colin observed her directly, his eyes tracking her subtle movements, the slight tremor in her hands, the carefully controlled rhythm of her breathing, the tension in her jaw. Not with desire or curiosity, but with the automatic assessment he applied to everything in his environment, identifying potential variables, strengths, weaknesses, threat levels, exploitation points. The intelligence file had not mentioned that her eyes contained flecks of silver that caught the light when she finally, briefly met his gaze with undisguised loathing. The officiator, a senior human diplomat with minimal understanding of Shelar customs, droned through the formal words that had been negotiated through days of tense cultural exchange. The ceremony incorporated elements from both traditions, stripped of any spiritual significance and reduced to contractual language. Do you, Emily of House Shelar, accept this union as binding under the terms of the Cooperative Settlement Agreement, Section 12, Paragraph 4? The officiator asked, his tone suggesting he was reviewing supply requisitions rather than performing a marriage. Emily's throat worked as she swallowed before answering. I do so acknowledge, she replied, the formal words clearly bitter on her tongue. Do you, Colin Kennedy, accept this union as binding under the terms of the Cooperative Settlement Agreement, Section 12, Paragraph 4? Acknowledged, Colin responded, his voice neither enthusiastic nor reluctant, simply confirming receipt of an order. No vows of love or devotion passed between them, no promises of fidelity or support. This was a contract, nothing more. A document signed in the presence of witnesses who cared only for its political implications. As the final pronouncement was made, sealing their union according to the laws of both peoples, Emily finally turned her full attention to Colin. Her gaze was arctic cold, carrying the accumulated hatred of her conquered people. Colin met her eyes without reaction, unmoved by her anger, neither threatened nor offended by it. When the ceremony concluded, they walked separately from the hall, their first act as a married couple being to move in opposite directions. The mandatory reception that followed was equally stilted. Military and political leaders made pointed small talk, while Shelar representatives stood in careful clusters, speaking only when directly addressed. Emily performed her role with rigid dignity, accepting congratulations with minimal responses while maintaining careful distance from her new husband. Colin circulated as instructed, exchanging precisely 7 words with each superior officer who approached him. His programming for social interaction was limited, but adequate for controlled environments. Commander Hayes watched him with poorly concealed concern, especially when Colin systematically consumed exactly 1 glass of ceremonial wine, taking precisely measured sips at calculated intervals. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the reception hall's windows, a young lieutenant approached Colin with obvious nervousness. Sir, command has requested your presence for a security briefing. It appears there's been unusual movement detected in the outer perimeter sensors. Colin set down his empty glass and nodded. Understood. I'll report immediately. The lieutenant hesitated. Sir, Commander Hayes suggested that perhaps, given the occasion, security concerns take precedence, Colin stated, already moving toward the exit. He paused briefly near Emily, who was engaged in tense conversation with the human cultural liaison. I've been called for duty. The reception will continue without me. Emily looked up at him, surprise briefly replacing the hostility in her expression. Leaving your own wedding celebration for work? How admirably dedicated. The sarcasm in her tone was cutting. "Security concerns take precedence," he repeated, then turned and left without waiting for a response. The briefing was short and focused. Perimeter sensors had detected unusual patterns of movement beyond the settlement boundaries. The signatures didn't match known Shalar resistance patterns, and the scale suggested something larger than typical Tsar hunting parties. "We've lost contact with 2 observation posts," the intelligence officer explained, highlighting positions on the tactical display. "Drone reconnaissance shows signs of struggle, but no bodies." "Tsar raiding patterns have evolved," Cullen observed. "Previous encounters indicated scavenging behavior, not prisoner taking." "That's our assessment as well. Something's changed in their behavior. We're increasing perimeter security and initiating Defense Protocol Theta." Cullen absorbed the information, already calculating potential scenarios. "I'll perform a reconnaissance sweep of the northeast quadrant at dawn." "Negative," Commander Hayes interrupted, entering the briefing room. "Your primary assignment remains the Shilar Integration Project. We have regular forces for perimeter security." Cullen turned to face him. "Sir, if this represents evolved Tsar behavior, specialized assessment would be—" "That's an order, Kennedy." Hayes cut him off. "You're not to leave the settlement without direct authorization. Your presence here is politically significant. The Shilar need to see that we're honoring the agreement." Cullen fell silent, accepting the directive despite tactical disagreement. "Understood, sir." 3 days later, a piercing alarm shattered the afternoon quiet, its high-frequency wail designed to penetrate even the soundproofed buildings of the command center. Cullen's reaction was instantaneous, muscle memory activating before conscious thought. He abandoned the supply inventory he had been reviewing and moved directly toward the armory, his stride purposeful but unhurried. Panic was inefficient. Assessment first, then action. The settlement's central communications system crackled to life. "This is not a drill. Multiple perimeter breaches detected in sectors 7 through 12. All civilians report to designated shelter areas. All security personnel to defensive positions." Cullen diverted from the armory, instead heading toward the command center where he could obtain complete tactical information. As he crossed the main square, he spotted Emily frozen near the administrative building, watching in visible horror as civilians rushed toward the shelters. Her position was exposed, vulnerable, a tactical liability. From beyond the rocky outcroppings surrounding the settlement, a wave of blue-furred creatures poured forth in numbers never before documented. The Tsars moved on all fours, their bodies low to the ground as they charged with terrifying speed. Their primitive bone weapons and natural physical advantages had always made them dangerous, but never before had they demonstrated this level of coordinated attack behavior. Cullen rapidly assessed the situation. The settlement's shield generators activated, energy fields flaring to life as the first wave of attackers hit. But the system had been calibrated for energy weapons and high-velocity projectiles, not the primitive bone spears and natural weapons of the Tsars. The defense systems faltered as the creatures breached the perimeter in multiple locations simultaneously. Adjusting his immediate objective, Cullen changed direction and moved toward Emily. Civilian protection was standard protocol, and her political value elevated her priority status. Just as he reached her, the nearby fuel generator overloaded from emergency power rerouting, the safety systems compromised by the attack. The explosion sent a wall of flame erupting between them and the rest of the defenders, cutting off direct access to the command center and defensive positions. Without hesitation, Cullen grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her away from the spreading fire and chaos. "Move! Now!" "What are you doing?" she demanded, struggling against his iron grip while staring back at the battle unfolding behind them. "My people will die," he finished for her, his voice dispassionate despite the urgency of their situation. "So will mine. We're cut off from defensive positions and outgunned. Tactical retreat is the only viable option." Emily's eyes widened as she processed his words, then narrowed yet as she looked beyond him to the battle. Another explosion rocked the ground, closer this time. The Tsar advance was swift and brutal, their attack patterns suggesting intelligence beyond previous encounters. Human and Shilar defenders fought side by side out of desperate necessity, but they were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Cullen didn't wait for her to make a decision. Survival required immediate action, not debate. He maintained his grip on her arm and pulled her toward the wilderness, away from the settlement and into the rocky terrain beyond the northern perimeter. Emily resisted for several steps before the reality of their situation became undeniable. The settlement was falling. Staying meant certain death. With a final agonized look back at the only home she had ever known, Emily stopped fighting and began running alongside Colin, leaving behind the sounds of combat and the acrid smell of burning structures. The wilderness beckoned, unknown, unforgiving, but offering the only chance of survival. Night had fallen by the time they found shelter, a small cave set into a cliff face, its entrance partially concealed by indigenous vegetation. Wind howled through the rocky terrain, carrying the distant sounds of the continuing battle that had pursued them throughout their escape. Emily sat as far from Colin as the confined space allowed, her arms wrapped around herself, shivering from both the dropping temperature and the after effects of shock. Colin methodically secured their position, checking the cave for signs of previous occupation or alternative exits. Satisfied with the defensibility of their shelter, he gathered vegetation suitable for insulation and created a small, smokeless heat source using chemical components from his emergency pack. The blue-tinged flame provided minimal light but sufficient warmth to prevent hypothermia. In the dim illumination, he noticed a gash on Emily's arm, dark indigo blood staining the torn fabric of her sleeve. The injury required treatment to prevent infection and maintain optimal functionality. Without a word, he tore a clean strip from his undershirt and approached her. Emily flinched when he reached for her injured arm, pressing herself further against the cave wall. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, the first complete sentence he'd spoken to her since they fled. "The wound requires treatment to prevent sepsis. This environment contains unknown bacterial agents that could be lethal to your physiology." "Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe," she replied with bitter sarcasm, "considering your reputation among my people is built entirely on your capacity for inflicting pain." Despite her words, she reluctantly extended her arm, watching him with suspicious intensity. Colin cleaned the wound with water from his canteen, his movements precise and clinical. The cut was clean but deep, likely from debris during the initial explosion. "You'll need antibiotics within 48 hours, he informed her as he bound the makeshift bandage around her arm. The settlement's medical supplies would have standard formulations for Shilar physiology. "Assuming there's a settlement to return to," Emily responded, her voice hollow. Colin didn't offer false reassurance. Lies were inefficient. Based on attack patterns and numbers, complete overrun is the most probable outcome. Survivors will likely regroup at secondary positions or evacuate to orbital platforms. Emily closed her eyes, absorbing this assessment with visible pain. When she opened them again, they glistened with moisture she refused to let fall. "Why did you save me? Why not leave me behind and improve your own chances of survival?" Colin moved to the cave entrance and settled into a position that gave him clear sight of the terrain outside. The twin moons cast enough light to reveal any approaching threat. "You're my assignment," he stated simply. "Your assignment," she repeated flatly, "not your wife." The distinction is semantic in our current situation. Emily studied him in the faint light, this strange human who was now her husband in name. "Aren't you going to sleep? You've been awake and active for at least 20 hours. "No," was all he said, becoming a silent sentinel against the night. Emily wrapped her arms around her knees and leaned back against the rough cave wall. "What are you?" she asked quietly, the question seeming to emerge unbidden. Colin didn't turn from his vigilance. "Specialist, Advanced Tactical Operations, Serial Designation CK-137. "That's not what I meant," Emily persisted. "You're not like the other humans. You don't react like them. Your eyes don't register emotion. Your voice never changes inflection. What did they do to you to make you this way?" For the first time, Colin was silent, not from efficiency, but from something approximating uncertainty. After several moments, he replied, "Optimal functionality requires elimination of performance-degrading variables. Emotion is inefficient. Fear causes hesitation. Attachment clouds judgment. These weaknesses were removed." "Removed," Emily echoed, a new understanding dawning in her expression. "They altered your neurological structure, reconditioned your responses." She paused, then asked more softly, "Was it voluntary?" The question activated memory fragments Colin rarely accessed, a younger version of himself. Pain, resistance, then acceptance. Purpose replacing identity. "It was necessary," he finally answered. neither confirming nor denying her assumption. Emily said nothing more, but her gaze lingered on him with something new. Not quite sympathy, but a recognition of something unexpected. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into uneasy sleep while Colin maintained his watch, as unmovable as the stone around them. Dawn brought no relief. The sounds of battle had ceased during the night, but columns of smoke still rose from the direction of the settlement. Colin roused Emily with minimal contact, respecting her instinctive aversion to him while ensuring she was alert. "We need to move," he stated. "This position is too close to the settlement. Tsar hunting parties will expand their search perimeter after securing the main target." Emily rose stiffly, her body unaccustomed to sleeping on stone. She attempted to smooth her disheveled appearance, a reflexive dignity that Colin noted with clinical interest. Psychological resilience was a survival asset. "Move where?" she questioned, her voice rough from thirst. "Into completely unknown territory? We have no maps, minimal supplies, and no knowledge of what might be waiting for us." Colin offered her the water canteen. "The alternative is certain death. Unknown variables offer higher survival probability than confirmed threats." Emily accepted the water, taking careful sips as she'd observed him doing. "You've convinced me with your charming rhetoric," she said dryly. "Lead on, husband." If Colin recognized the sarcasm, he showed no reaction. Instead, he led them deeper into the wilderness, away from both human and Shalar territories. His movement through the rugged landscape was purposeful, each step placed with deliberate care to minimize noise and leave minimal traces. When they came across tracks pressed into the soft earth near a water source, Colin immediately crouched to examine them. The distinctive paw prints were larger than those he'd encountered in previous Tsar encounters, suggesting either mature specimens or possibly a subspecies adapted to this region. He pointed to the tracks, then gestured in the direction they were heading before indicating a different path. "Tsar hunting party. At least 7 individuals, moving parallel to our intended route. We adjust course." "How can you tell there are 7? Emily asked, studying the confusing overlap of prints. "Stride length variations, weight distribution. One is injured, favoring right hind leg. That one is falling behind, creating wider spacing in the pattern." Emily looked at him with new appreciation. "You learn to track from my people. Those are Shilar Ranger techniques. Tactical adaptation includes absorbing effective methodologies regardless of source," Colin responded, already moving in their new direction. As they walked, Colin's attention shifted constantly between their surroundings and Emily herself, assessing her pace, her endurance, the efficiency of her movement over difficult terrain. When she stumbled from fatigue or uncertain footing, he slowed his pace without comment, calculating optimal travel speed against energy conservation. Near midday, he stopped by a cluster of plants with distinctive purple-tinged leaves. He broke off a leaf, crushed it between his fingers, smelled it, then discarded it with a minute shake of his head. At another plant with bulbous orange growth, he picked a small fruit, evaluated its ripeness through multiple sensory inputs, then offered it to Emily. She hesitated, hunger warring with suspicion of both the unfamiliar food and the hand that offered it. "It's safe," he said simply, "similar to cultivars grown in the settlement's agricultural sector. High sugar content, moderate protein, no toxins detectable through standard field testing methods." Emily's hunger eventually won over caution. The fruit was tart but refreshing, its juice momentarily alleviating her thirst. Colin located more of the plants, and they ate in silence before continuing their journey. Throughout the day, Colin's lessons continued without explicit instruction. He demonstrated through action rather than explanation how to walk to minimize tracks by stepping on stone rather than soil when possible, how to identify water sources by observing local vegetation patterns, how to read the landscape for potential shelter or danger. Emily observed and adapted quickly, her natural intelligence allowing her to internalize the survival techniques without requiring detailed explanation. As twilight approached, transforming the alien landscape into a terrain of elongated shadows, a high-pitched howl echoed through the rocky corridor they were traversing. Colin froze instantly, his head turning toward the sound with predatory focus. Before Emily could fully process the danger, he pulled her into a narrow crevice between 2 massive boulders, pressing her against the rock wall and covering her mouth with his hand to silence her instinctive gasp. The space was barely large enough for both of them. Pressed against his chest, Emily felt his heartbeat against her back, steady and controlled, while her own raced with fear. Through the narrow opening between the rocks, shadows moved past their hiding place. The Tsar hunting party passed within meters of where they hid, their blue fur almost luminescent in the fading light. Emily counted 5 creatures, each larger than any she had seen in previous encounters near the settlement boundaries. They moved with purpose, clearly tracking rather than randomly patrolling. Colin kept them hidden for long minutes after the hunting party disappeared from view, listening for any stragglers or circling scouts. When he finally released her, Emily exhaled shakily, her body trembling slightly from the sustained tension. "They're hunting us, specifically," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "How can you be certain?" Emily asked, equally soft, the fear of discovery still acute. "Their movement pattern is systematic, not opportunistic. They're tracking specific targets, not generally foraging." He studied her face in the dim light. "They followed our trail from the settlement with intention. They know who you are." Emily swallowed hard, the implications sinking in. The daughter of the deposed chief would be a valuable hostage in any negotiation with the remaining Shilar settlements. "Or a symbolic kill to demonstrate dominance," Colin added with characteristic bluntness. "Either way, they won't abandon the hunt easily." The reality of their situation settled between them. They weren't just fleeing from danger, they were being actively pursued by predators with intelligence and purpose. Emily wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-comfort that Colin observed without comment. "We need to increase our defensive capabilities," he stated after a moment of calculation. "Current armament is insufficient against multiple attackers." That night, while Emily kept nervous watch, Colin fashioned a weapon from a branch of the local ironwood tree, a dense, fibrous wood with remarkable tensile strength. For hours, he methodically carved it with his combat knife, shaping one end to a lethal point. He heated the tip in their small, carefully shielded fire, hardening it to increase penetration capability. The finished spear looked primitive compared to human military technology, but in his hands it transformed from simple wood to an instrument of precise lethality. Emily watched the process with growing interest, noting the care and attention he invested in each step. There was something almost meditative in his focus, as though the creation of the weapon was not just tactical necessity, but an expression of something deeper, a connection to more primal human skills that predated their advanced technology. When he finished crafting the spear, Colin held out his combat knife to her, handle first. "You need a weapon for it," he stated. Emily stared at the knife, its blade still warm from being used to carve the spear. "I don't know how to use that effectively," she admitted, the confession difficult for her pride. "You'll learn," he said simply, "or you'll die when we encounter the next hunting party." The stark assessment hung between them, its truth undeniable. Emily accepted the knife, feeling its unfamiliar weight in her hand. "Why are you doing this? Helping me survive? You could move faster alone, improve your own chances of reaching your people." Colin regarded her with that same unreadable expression, his eyes reflecting the small fire's glow without revealing anything within. "You're my mission now." "Your mission," she repeated bitterly, "not your wife." "The distinction is irrelevant in our current environment," he responded. "Survival parameters require mutual cooperation. My assignment includes ensuring your continued existence." "How romantic," Emily muttered, testing the knife's edge with her thumb. "And if ensuring your own survival someday conflicts with mine, what then, husband?" For the first time, Colin seemed to consider a question rather than immediately calculating a response. "I will determine appropriate action if that scenario materializes." Emily gave a small, humorless laugh. "At least you're honest about it." The following day brought new challenges as they navigated increasingly difficult terrain. Their path led along a narrow ridge overlooking a deep ravine, the drop beside them steep enough that survival of a fall was mathematically improbable. Recent rainfall had made the ground treacherous, the thin layer of soil becoming slick clay that offered minimal traction. Colin led the way, testing each section before proceeding, his movements deliberate and precise. Emily followed with careful attention, placing her feet exactly where he had stepped, mimicking his balance adjustments and hand positions on the rock face beside them. Despite her caution, a section of the path crumbled beneath her weight without warning. Emily felt a terrible sensation of ground giving way, gravity claiming her with hungry insistence. A scream caught in her throat as her body tilted toward the abyss. Pure instinct drove her hand outward, grasping desperately at a jutting rock formation. Her fingers closed around the protrusion, leaving her dangling over the precipice, legs swinging in empty space as loose stones tumbled into the depths below. Colin reacted with inhuman speed. He dropped flat on the remaining path, extending his body to reach her while maintaining sufficient anchor points to support both their weights. His hand locked around her wrist like a vice, strong enough to bruise but secure against failure. "Other hand," he commanded, his voice showing the first hint of strain Emily had heard from him. "Release the rock. Grab my arm." Trusting him was against every instinct Emily had developed since the human invasion of her world. But fear of death proved stronger than pride. She released her tenuous grip on the rock and swung her free hand up to clutch his forearm. With methodical strength, Colin slowly pulled her upward, the muscles in his arms and shoulders visibly straining against the fabric of his tactical uniform. When Emily was high enough to gain purchase on the ledge with her knees, they made the final effort together, collapsing side by side on the narrow path, breathing heavily from exertion and residual adrenaline. "Thank you," Emily said between breaths, the words feeling foreign on her tongue when directed at him. Colin nodded once in acknowledgement, his own respiration returning to normal with unnatural quickness. He rose to a kneeling position, examining her for injuries before continuing forward, as though the life-threatening incident had been merely a scheduled delay. But something had shifted between them. It was the first time they had touched to save rather than from necessity or aggression. Emily found herself studying his movements with new attention as they continued their journey, noting the efficiency that she had previously interpreted solely as coldness. There was a strange grace to his calculated precision, like watching a predator that had perfected its form through evolution. Hunger became their constant companion as they ventured deeper into the wilderness. The small supply of fruit and edible plants they gathered along the way provided minimal sustenance for their energy expenditure. By the third day after their escape, Emily felt the weakness of insufficient caloric intake affecting her endurance and cognitive function. Colin, too, recognized the unsustainable nature of their situation. While resting in the afternoon shade of a rock formation, he noted fresh tracks of a six-legged herbivore common to the region, a creature known to the Shilar as thulak, valued for both meat and hide. He crouched beside Emily, drawing a simple plan in the dirt with the tip of his knife. The scratches formed a crude but effective map of their immediate surroundings. He indicated her position behind a specific rock formation, then his own location downwind of the animal's likely path. With careful gestures, he demonstrated how she should drive the creature toward where he would wait with his spear. Emily studied the plan and nodded her understanding of the coordinated strategy. The hunt would require perfect timing and communication without words, a test of their developing ability to function as a unit despite their fundamental differences. Their first attempt failed when Emily moved from her position too soon, alerting the creature to danger before it entered the kill zone. The thulak bounded away with surprising agility for its bulky frame, disappearing into the undergrowth before Colin could get within striking distance. Rather than displaying frustration at the failure, Colin simply indicated they should try again, making slight adjustments to their positioning based on the animal's demonstrated behavior patterns. The second time, Emily waited with greater patience, watching for Colin's signal before emerging from her hiding place and creating precisely the right amount of disturbance to startle the creature in the desired direction. The thulak reacted predictably, fleeing directly toward what it perceived as safety. Colin's throw was mathematically perfect, the spear piercing the creature's side and finding vital organs. The kill was quick and clean, minimizing suffering while maximizing resource acquisition. But the dying thulak's distress call echoed across the valley, a high-pitched keening that carried further than either of them anticipated. Within moments, answering calls sounded from multiple directions. Colin immediately abandoned the kill site, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her toward a dense thicket of thorny vegetation. "More coming," he stated tersely. "Thulak travel in family groups." That was a juvenile. They reached the thicket just as the undergrowth began to shake. 3 adult thulak, nearly twice the size of the one they'd killed, burst into the clearing. Their 6-legged bodies moved with surprising grace as they discovered their fallen offspring. The largest, presumably the parent, lowered its elongated head and emitted a mournful sound that raised the hair on Emily's neck. Colin and Emily remained motionless within their thorny concealment, barely breathing. The adult thulak began a methodical search pattern, using their highly developed olfactory sensory organs to track the predators that had killed their young. One came so close that Emily could see the individual scales on its armored hide, iridescent blue-green in the afternoon light. When the creature turned its head toward their hiding place, Emily was certain they had been discovered. Its large compound eyes, reminiscent of Earth insects but unsettlingly intelligent, seemed to look directly at her. She felt Colin's hand close around her wrist, a silent communication to remain absolutely still. The moment stretched into agonizing tension, neither human nor alien moving. Then, with startling speed, the Thulak lunged, not at them, but at a small scavenger that had approached the kill from the opposite direction. The brutal efficiency with which it dispatched the unfortunate creature demonstrated that the herbivorous Thulak were far from defenseless. The adults dragged the body of their fallen young away, disappearing into the wilderness and leaving the smaller scavenger's remains as a grim warning. Only when the sounds of their departure had completely faded did Collins signal it was safe to emerge. "We need to retrieve the spear," he said, already moving toward the kill site. "Is that wise?" Emily questioned. "They might return. The weapon is necessary for survival. The risk is acceptable." Together they approached the original hunting ground, now marked by dark blood soaking into the alien soil. The Thulak had taken their young, but left most of the meat, a behavior Colin noted with scientific detachment as he recovered his spear and quickly harvested what protein they could safely carry. That night, they roasted meat over a carefully constructed fire designed to minimize smoke visibility. The rich protein was a welcome change from their limited diet of forage plants. Emily watched Colin across the small flames, seeing him not just as a human soldier or reluctant husband, but as a survivor whose skills were keeping them both alive in this hostile environment. "Where did you learn to hunt like that?" she asked, breaking their usual silence. "The military wouldn't teach such primitive techniques." Colin continued methodically cleaning his knife blade, seemingly focused entirely on the task. Just when Emily thought he wouldn't answer, he spoke. "Sierra Nevada, before military integration. Survival training with my grandfather." The personal details surprised Emily more than the information itself. "You have family? Somehow I imagined you were created in a laboratory." Something almost imperceptible changed in Colin's expression, a microscopic tightening around the eyes that would have been invisible to anyone not studying him as carefully as Emily had learned to do. "Family connections were severed upon program acceptance," he stated, "counterproductive to operational efficiency. They took you from your family to turn you into what you are now," Emily persisted, unexpectedly disturbed by the implication. "I volunteered," Colin corrected, though something in his tone suggested a more complicated truth. "The program selected for specific genetic and psychological profiles, candidates with highest potential for adaptation." "What adaptation?" Emily repeated. "You mean compliance with whatever they did to eliminate your emotional responses?" Colin met her gaze across the fire. "Emotion is a luxury in survival situations. You've benefited from my conditioning every day since the attack." Emily couldn't argue with that reality, however uncomfortable it made her. They lapsed back into silence, but something had changed in their dynamic. Emily had glimpsed something behind the impassive exterior. Not emotion, perhaps, but history, context. The revelation that Colin had once been someone's grandson, had learned hunting from family rather than military protocols, added unexpected dimension to the human weapon she had been forced to marry. Their fragile routine was shattered the next morning when they stumbled upon a Tsar scouting party while navigating a narrow pass between rocky formations. Two of the blue-furred hunters appeared without warning from behind an outcropping, their bone weapons raised and ready. The larger one emitted a high-pitched call, clearly an alert to others in the vicinity. Colin reacted instantly, pushing Emily behind him and facing the threat with spear raised. "Run on my signal," he instructed, his voice completely calm despite the imminent danger. "Northwest direction. Don't stop." The fight erupted before Emily could respond. Colin moved with lethal efficiency, engaging both creatures simultaneously. His spear found the chest of the first Tsar with perfect precision, driving deep into vital organs. But as the creature fell, its massive clawed hands swept outward in a dying gesture, catching Colin's leg and leaving a deep gash across his thigh. The second Tsar seized the opportunity, leaping over its fallen companion and charging toward Emily with terrifying speed. Colin, momentarily disabled by his injury, couldn't intercept in time. Frozen in terror, Emily stared at approaching death. The creature's fangs bared in a snarling grimace. its clawed hands reaching for her with predatory certainty. In that suspended moment, her training at the Shilar War College seemed abstract and useless. Instead, muscle memory recalled how Colin held his knife during their days in the wilderness. Her hand moved almost independently of conscious thought, bringing the blade up, embracing her body just as the Tsar crashed into her with its full weight. The knife sank into the creature's abdomen, parting blue fur and finding soft tissue beneath. Warm blood spilled over Emily's hands and forearms as she screamed, not just from fear, but from the primal shock of taking life with her own hands. The wounded Tsar's momentum drove her backwards, its weight pinning her to the ground as it thrashed in pain and rage. Emily felt its claws raking her shoulders, felt its hot breath against her face as it snapped at her throat. Colin was there in an instant, despite his injury, hauling the wounded creature off her with a display of strength that defied his blood loss. He finished the Tsar with a decisive strike to its neck using Emily's fallen knife, severing the major blood vessels. Emily lay where she had fallen, staring at her bloodied hands in shock. They trembled uncontrollably as the reality of what had happened settled over her. "I killed it," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I killed it." Colin knelt beside her despite his bleeding leg, his eyes clinically assessing her for serious injuries. "You survived," he corrected, his voice holding something almost like respect beneath the usual flatness. "That's all that matters in this environment." He tore strips from the Tsar's carrying pouch, using the materials to bind his own leg wound before helping Emily to her feet. She swayed slightly, still disoriented by the violence and her participation in it. "We need to move immediately," Colin stated, already scanning their surroundings. The caller alerted others. "More will come to investigate." "You're injured," Emily noted, her gaze dropping to the blood-soaked binding on his thigh. "Functional within acceptable parameters," he responded, gathering their minimal supplies. "The wound missed major arteries and tendons. Movement is possible." They pushed on despite Colin's injury, his gait showing only minimal compensation for the damage. Emily found herself watching him with new awareness, noticing the subtle signs of pain he controlled but couldn't entirely eliminate. A slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible hesitation when weight shifted to his injured leg. By midday, they had climbed to higher ground, following a game trail that wound up to a plateau overlooking the vast valley that eventually led back toward Emily's home city. The elevated position offered both tactical advantage and breathtaking perspective on the alien landscape. But what they saw from this vantage point stole the breath from Emily's lungs for entirely different reasons. The valley teemed with Tsars, not dozens as they had encountered before, but hundreds, perhaps thousands. A full migration or war party filled the lowlands, their blue fur creating a rippling azure carpet across the terrain. At the center of the massive gathering stood a giant leader, easily twice the size of the others, directing the horde with guttural calls that carried even to the distant plateau where Emily and Colin observed in stunned silence. Emily's fingers dug into Colin's arm in involuntary horror. "There are so many," she whispered, the words inadequate for the scale of the threat before them. "They'll overwhelm both our peoples. No settlement could withstand those numbers." Colin didn't respond to her fear. His gaze remained fixed on the Tsar leader, studying its movements with predatory intensity. He observed the positioning of the guards around the massive creature, noting the deference shown by the others, analyzing the command structure put in their organization. He wasn't seeing an overwhelming force, he was seeing a target. "Their social structure is hierarchical," he stated after several minutes of observation. "Remove the leader, and the organization fragments." Emily stared at him in disbelief. "That's your analysis? How to fight them? We should be figuring out how to warn both our peoples, not planning suicide missions." "Warning is irrelevant if the threat remains intact," Colin responded. "Neither human nor Shilar defensive capabilities are designed for this scale of assault. Conventional resistance would fail." "So what do you propose? That we two somehow eliminate their leader and magically solve the problem?" The sarcasm in Emily's voice couldn't fully mask her fear. Colin met her gaze, his expression unchanged. "Yes." The single-word response hung between them, its absurdity almost comical if not for the deadly seriousness with which it was delivered. Emily laughed, a short, sharp sound containing no humor. "You're insane," she concluded. "Your conditioning has eliminated not just emotion but reason as well. Tactical assessment is based on observable patterns and historical precedent," Colin countered. Tsar pack dynamics consistently show disintegration after alpha elimination. Their coordination requires direct leadership. Emily looked back at the valley, at the thousands of deadly predators gathering for what could only be a major assault on settled territories. Even if you're right about their social structure, how exactly do you propose we get close enough to their leader to kill it? Walk through thousands of czars saying, "Excuse me," as we pass? That evening, Colin drew a map in the sand using a stick and small stones to represent key terrain features. His tactical planning was methodical and detailed, despite the primitive tools available. He indicated a narrow canyon that cut through the mountains between their current position and the valley where the Tsar horde had gathered. With the stick, he pointed to Emily, then to the mouth of the canyon. Next, he indicated himself, then to a position above the canyon where overhanging rocks created a natural choke point. The plan took shape in the dirt before them, simple but devastating in its strategic elegance. Emily understood immediately. "You want me to be bait," she said, her voice flat with realization. "The leader will pursue you personally," Colin confirmed, his tone matter of fact. "The daughter of the Shilar chief is a prize it won't delegate to subordinates. And when it follows me into the canyon with its elite guard, I collapse the passage, trapping it with a manageable number of protectors. We fight them separately from the main force." Emily stared at him across the crude map drawn in dirt, searching his face for any sign of doubt or recognition of the plan's audacity. "You're planning to fight their leader? Just the two of us against that monster and its guards?" "Yes. That's suicide." "No," Colin said with absolute certainty, pointing to specific features of the terrain he had mapped. "It's tactical advantage. Confined space negates their numerical superiority. Higher ground provides strategic positioning. The rockfall creates isolation from reinforcements." Emily studied his face in the fading light, searching for fear or hesitation and finding none. This was the human her people had feared since first contact, not because of superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but because of this calculating will that turned impossible odds into mere problems to be solved through applied violence. "Why would I help you with this insanity?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "Why not just run, try to find survivors from my people, warn them of what's coming?" "Because you've seen the horde," Colin said simply, gesturing toward the valley. "You know what happens if we don't stop them. Your people can't evacuate in time. Neither can mine." Emily looked away, unable to deny the truth in his assessment. The Tsar numbers were too great, their coordination too effective. Conventional defenses would be overwhelmed before any large-scale evacuation could be completed. When she looked back at Colin, she saw not the enemy she'd been given to in a political marriage, but a potential ally in survival. Not just her own, but that of both their species. She nodded once, the gesture containing both agreement and resignation. "How long do we have to prepare?" "Based on their movement patterns, they'll begin advancing toward populated areas within 48 hours, Colin replied. "We strike at dawn." That night, as they camped in a protected overhang with good visibility of the surrounding terrain, Emily watched Colin check and recheck his weapons. He'd fashioned a backup spear and several smaller throwing implements from materials gathered throughout the day. His movements were precise yet fluid, each motion flowing into the next with practiced efficiency. "Have you always been like this?" she asked suddenly, "even before whatever program changed you?" Colin's hands paused briefly in their work. "Clarify the parameters of your question. Were you always so disconnected from yourself, from others? Or did you once feel things like fear, or gun, or—" She hesitated, then added, "love." For several moments, Colin continued his preparations without answering, and Emily thought he might ignore the question entirely. When he finally spoke, his voice held a quality she hadn't heard before. Not emotion exactly, but perhaps the echo of where emotion had once existed. "I remember fear," he said quietly. "Before the program, during high-altitude training, the fear served no purpose. It impeded function. Removing it improved performance." The admission triggered a cascade of fragmented memories Colin rarely accessed. The program, the transformation, the pain that had forged him into what he was now. He had been 22 when he volunteered, a promising special forces operator with exceptional physical capabilities, but hampered by what his evaluators called excessive empathy. His psychological profile noted his tendency to prioritize civilian safety over mission objectives, a trait the program directors identified as exploitable weakness. Colin remembered the sterile white room where it had begun, the doctors with their clinical detachment, the explanation that seemed reasonable at the time, neural recalibration to enhance performance, minimize psychological trauma, and optimize decision-making under pressure. They never used words like emotional suppression or personality alteration. Those realizations came later, after the procedures had advanced too far to reverse. The injections had been the first phase, chemical compounds designed to increase neural plasticity, making the brain more receptive to the next stages. Then came the cognitive conditioning, thousands of hours of specialized simulations paired with targeted neural stimulation, scenarios designed to systematically desensitize emotional responses while reinforcing tactical efficiency. Rescue missions where saving civilians resulted in mission failure and strategic disaster. Combat simulations where hesitation led to catastrophic outcomes. Over and over, until his brain rewired itself to prioritize objective completion above all else. The final phase had been the most invasive, surgical implants at key points in his limbic system, allowing for real-time modulation of emotional responses. The technology was experimental, classified far beyond top secret. Colin was one of only 7 subjects to receive the full protocol. 3 had died during integration. 1 had committed suicide after field deployment. Another had gone rogue and been decommissioned. The 7th was serving in a different operational theater, as emotionally detached and lethally efficient as Colin himself. What the program directors hadn't anticipated, couldn't have known, was that the procedure didn't truly eliminate emotions. It buried them beneath layers of neural suppression, creating a psychological structure where feelings still formed but remained inaccessible to conscious awareness. They existed as phantom sensations, shadow influences on decision-making that occasionally manifested in unexpected ways. The program had created not emotionless machines but compartmentalized humans, their natural responses locked away behind neural firewalls. Sometimes, in rare moments between missions, Colin would experience brief integration failures, flashes of emotion that broke through the conditioning, a sunset that triggered an inexplicable moment of aesthetic appreciation, a child's laughter that resonated with some buried memory of his own childhood. These moments were quickly suppressed, either by his conscious discipline or by the autonomous functions of his neural implants. But their existence suggested that beneath the tactical exterior, something fundamentally human remained. Looking at Emily across the small fire, Colin experienced one of those rare integration failures. Her question about his past had bypassed expected conversational patterns, creating a vulnerability in his psychological defense structure. For a fraction of a second, he felt something that might have been regret, not just for what he had lost, but for what she saw when she looked at him. Not a person, but a weapon wearing human form. The moment passed quickly, neural modulators adjusting to suppress the anomalous activity. His expression remained unchanged, giving no indication of the complex processes occurring beneath the surface. And the other emotions? Did they remove everything that made you human? Colin met her gaze across the fire. They removed what made me vulnerable. The result has kept us both alive. Emily nodded slowly, a new understanding forming. Tomorrow I'll be depending on that result with my life. Yes, Colin agreed, and I will be depending on what they couldn't remove from you, your emotional connection to your people. Your desire to protect them will make you effective bait. The bluntness of his assessment should have been offensive, but Emily found herself appreciating his honesty. Then we both bring our strengths to this suicide mission. It's not suicide if we survive, Colin pointed out with impeccable logic. Emily laughed despite herself, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise them both. I suppose that's technically true. The next dawn arrived with disconcerting tranquility, the landscape peaceful under the pale light of early morning. Emily and Colin had positioned themselves near the canyon entrance before first light, using the darkness to approach undetected by Tsar sentries. Emily wore a makeshift cloak fashioned from the blue fur of the Tsar they had killed, not for warmth, but for visibility. The distinctive coloring would be immediately recognizable to the hunting party they intended to attract. Colin had applied a mixture of local clay and plant extract to her exposed skin, enhancing the natural blue tone to make her Gilar heritage even more apparent at a distance. Remember the timing, Colin instructed as they made final preparations. You need to be visible enough to be identified, but fast enough to avoid being caught before reaching the marker. Emily nodded, her heart already racing with anticipation. And if something goes wrong? If they catch me before I reach the choke point? Then improvise, Colin said simply. You've demonstrated adequate adaptability. Coming from him, it was high praise. Emily took a deep breath, centered herself using the meditation techniques she'd learned in the Shilar War College, and prepared for her role. I'll see you at the marker, she said, attempting to match his certainty. Try not to miss with the rockfall. I don't miss, Colin stated, not as boast, but as simple fact. With a final nod, they separated. Colin moved to his position high above the canyon, while Emily began her approach to the valley edge where Tsar scouts would be patrolling. She deliberately left tracks in the soft ground, breaking small branches and disturbing vegetation in ways that would be obvious to the predatory trackers. When she heard the first howls of discovery, a chill ran down her spine despite her preparation. The sound was closer than she had anticipated. The scouts more numerous and spread wider than their intelligence had indicated. Emily abandoned subtlety and began running toward the canyon entrance, no longer needing to pretend fear. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew louder and more frenzied. The communication calls changed pitch and pattern, suggesting they had indeed recognized her significance. She risked a glance back and immediately regretted it. At least a dozen Tsars were in direct pursuit, with more converging from different directions. Among them, rising above the others, was the massive form of the leader, its blue fur almost iridescent in the morning light. Emily pushed herself harder, her lungs burning and muscles screaming as she entered the narrow passage of the canyon. The walls rose steeply on either side, the path ahead growing progressively tighter. She focused on reaching the marker Colin had shown her, a distinctive rock formation that indicated where she should take cover. The Tsar were gaining. She could hear their breathing, the scrape of claws on stone. As she passed the marker, she dove behind a massive boulder, pressing herself against the canyon wall just as the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The sound was deafening, a cascade of cracking stone and rumbling earth as Colin triggered the rockfall from his position above. Massive boulders crashed down, blocking the canyon behind the lead pursuit group. Emily watched in horrified fascination as several Tsar were crushed beneath the falling rocks, while others leapt forward to avoid the collapse. When the dust cleared, the situation crystallized with terrifying clarity. The rockfall had worked, separating the leader and 5 elite guards from the main force. But the confined space now worked against Emily as well. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The surviving Tsar quickly spotted her position. The battle erupted without preamble. Colin dropped from his elevated position, his landing precise despite the 15-foot drop. His spear took the nearest guard through the shoulder, the impact so forceful that the wooden shaft snapped from the stress. Without hesitation, he drew his backup knife, facing the massive leader as it charged with surprising speed for its enormous size. Emily had her own problems. 2 guards had spotted her hiding place and were closing in from different directions, their bone weapons raised for killing strikes. Armed with only Colin's combat knife, she backed against the canyon wall, desperately recalling the lessons she'd absorbed watching him. Don't strike wildly. Wait for the opening. Use their momentum against them. The first guard lunged, its clawed arm extending fully. Emily sidestepped, slashing at the exposed limb as it passed. The creature howled in pain, but didn't fall, spinning with unnerving quickness to face her again. The second used the distraction to circle behind, attempting to flank her. Emily was forced to dive and roll across the rough ground, stone tearing at her skin, but allowing her to avoid the bone blade that would have severed her spine. Across the battleground, Colin fought with mechanical precision against the leader, his movements a study in efficiency. He dodged the powerful but predictable attacks, exploiting the creature's size against it in the confined space. But even his calculated combat style had limitations. A sweeping blow caught him across the chest, the force sending him sprawling against the canyon wall. The impact would have knocked an ordinary human unconscious, but Colin rolled immediately to his feet, blood streaming from a gash across his forehead. The leader pressed its advantage, recognizing the primary threat. It charged Colin again, this time connecting solidly and pinning him to the ground. Its massive claws dug into his shoulders as it lowered its fanged maw toward his throat, victory and bloodlust evident in its bestial features. Emily saw Colin's danger through the chaos of her own battle. One of her attackers had fallen back, nursing a deep wound to its leg, but the other was fully engaged in preventing her from reaching Colin. In desperate inspiration, she feinted toward her attacker, then abruptly hurled her knife with all her strength toward the leader. The throw wasn't skilled or precise, not the calculated strike Colin would have delivered, but panic and desperation lent it unexpected accuracy. The blade sank deep into the leader's shoulder, causing it to rear back in surprise and pain. Its killing bite interrupted mere inches from Colin's throat. That momentary distraction was all Colin needed. His hand found a sharp fragment of his broken spear on the ground beside him. With a single explosive movement that utilized his entire body's kinetic chain, he drove the jagged point deep into the leader's throat, just beneath the jaw where the fur thinned and the skin was vulnerable. He twisted as he thrust, ensuring catastrophic damage to major blood vessels. The leader's death cry echoed through the canyon, a chilling sound of rage and disbelief. Its massive body convulsed, blood gushing from the mortal wound and cascading over Colin in a macabre baptism. The creature's guards faltered, their coordinated attack dissolving into confusion as the Alpha's death disrupted the hierarchy they operated within. Colin didn't hesitate in exploiting their disorientation. He rolled from beneath the dying leader, retrieved Emily's thrown knife from its shoulder, and engaged the nearest guard with renewed purpose. His movements now contained an element Emily hadn't seen before. Not just calculation, but something approaching ferocity, as though the blood covering him had awakened something primal that his conditioning hadn't fully eliminated. Inspired by his resurgence, Emily grabbed a fallen bone weapon and fought with newfound determination. The remaining guards, their coordination shattered by the leader's death, fell one by one until finally, silence descended over the blood-soaked canyon. Beyond the rockfall, they could hear the chaos erupting in the main force. Without the Alpha's guidance, the strict hierarchy of the Tsar's social structure collapsed into disorder. The distant sounds of conflict suggested competing individuals attempting to claim leadership through combat, while others fled in disorganized bands, their purpose lost with their commander. Emily and Colin stood over the massive corpse of the leader, both breathing heavily, covered in blood, their own and their enemies'. Colin's face and chest were a mask of crimson, the wound on his forehead still bleeding freely. Emily's arms were scored with claw marks, her clothing torn and soaked with blue-black Tsar blood mixed with her own indigo vital fluid. Dawn had fully broken, painting the sky in brilliant shades of amber and gold, the beauty a stark contrast to the carnage surrounding them. For the first time, Emily really looked at the human beside her, not as an enemy or reluctant ally, but as someone who had fought alongside her, who had trusted her to play her part in their survival, someone whose blood had mingled with hers in common purpose. Colin extended his hand to help her climb over the rocky debris separating them, a simple gesture that somehow contained more meaning than any words could have conveyed. After only a moment's hesitation, Emily took it, feeling the strength and steadiness of his grip despite the wounds he had sustained. In the distance, dust clouds rose, a rescue party approaching from the direction of the settlement. Whether they were human or Shilar no longer seemed to matter. The personal war between Emily and Colin had ended in the blood-soaked canyon, replaced by something neither had expected. Respect, understanding, and perhaps the foundation of something neither had words to describe. As they made their way toward the approaching rescuers, Emily realized that the political marriage forced upon them had been meaningless, a hollow gesture between enemies. But what had formed in the wilderness, forged through blood and shared survival, was something far more powerful and genuine. A true alliance, not just between two individuals, but potentially between their peoples. Colin seemed to sense her thoughts, his perception more acute than his emotionless demeanor suggested. It wasn't just for show anymore, was it? He said quietly, his voice containing the barest hint of something that might, in another man, have been called feeling. Emily looked at the human who had begun as her enemy and somehow become something else entirely, partner, ally, perhaps eventually even friend. The blood of their common enemy covered them both, a symbolic joining more meaningful than any ceremonial ritual. No, she agreed, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. It wasn't. The rescue party drew closer, and Emily could now see that it contained both human and Gilar members, a joint effort born of mutual desperation in the face of the Tsar threat. Colin straightened beside her, his posture returning to military precision despite his injuries. Emily likewise squared her shoulders, drawing on her royal heritage to project dignity and strength. Together they walked forward to meet whatever future awaited them. The old world of enmity between their species had died in that canyon along with the Tsar leader. What would rise from its ashes remained to be seen. But for the first time since the human invasion of her world, Emily felt something that resembled hope. Not just for survival, but for something worth building. A genuine peace founded on mutual respect, rather than dominance and submission. As the rescue party reached them, a human officer stepped forward, his expression shifting from relief to shock as he took in their blood-covered appearances and the massive Tsar corpses visible behind them. "Kennedy, what the hell happened here?" the officer demanded. Cullen's response was characteristically precise. "Eliminated primaries are threat. Destabilized enemy force structure. Recommend immediate strike on disorganized remnants before new leadership emerges." The Shilar members of the rescue party stared at Emily with similar disbelief, their traditional formality forgotten in the face of her transformed appearance. Emily lifted her chin, meeting their gaze directly. "The human speaks truth," she stated in their native language. "Together we have accomplished what neither of our peoples could have done alone. The future must reflect this lesson, or we will not survive the next threat this world presents." As medical personnel rushed forward to assess their injuries, Emily felt Colin's gaze on her. She turned to find him watching her with an intensity that suggested his analytical mind was processing something new and unexpected. "What?" she asked quietly. "Adaptation," he responded simply. "You've demonstrated exceptional capability." From him, it was profound praise. Emily allowed herself a small smile despite the pain of her injuries. "As have you, husband. Perhaps there's hope for us yet." For just a moment, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched Colin's blood-streaked face. "Perhaps," he agreed, and in that word, spoken amid the aftermath of violence and survival, lay the foundation of a new beginning. Not just for two reluctant spouses, but for two civilizations that might yet learn to see strength in their differences rather than cause for conflict. In the days that followed, as they recovered in the joint human Shilar medical facility, their story spread throughout both communities. Some dismissed it as propaganda, a convenient narrative to justify the continued alliance. Others, particularly those who had witnessed the disorganized retreat of the surviving Tsar, recognized the truth. Two individuals from enemy species had accomplished what neither civilization could have managed alone. Emily's injuries healed faster than Colin's. Her Shilar physiology adapted to the planetary environment. She used her recovery time to meet with representatives from both sides, carefully recounting their experience and emphasizing the mutual benefits of cooperation. Her diplomatic training served her well as she navigated the complex politics of their fragile coalition. Colin, meanwhile, underwent multiple surgeries to repair the damage inflicted by the Tsar leader. Human medical technology struggled with his unique neural architecture. The implants that regulated his emotional responses had been damaged during the battle, creating unpredictable fluctuations in his carefully modulated brain chemistry. When Emily visited him during his recovery, she noticed subtle changes in his demeanor. His speech patterns had become less rigid, his observations occasionally including subjective assessments that would have been filtered out before. The doctors explained that they were working to stabilize his condition, but the original programming was proving difficult to fully restore. "Does it bother you?" Emily asked him during one visit, after observing him react with visible frustration to a failed attempt at standing unassisted. "These changes in your responses?" Colin considered the question with uncharacteristic thoughtfulness. "It's inefficient," he finally replied, "but not entirely negative. The integration creates new tactical perspectives." Emily nodded, understanding what he couldn't quite articulate. The damage had created cracks in his conditioning, allowing glimpses of his original personality to emerge. "Integration," she repeated, an appropriate term for many things. As their world began rebuilding from the Tsar attack, constructing new defenses and establishing joint settlements designed to withstand future threats, Emily and Colin found themselves becoming symbols of the new cooperation. Their forced political marriage, once an empty gesture, had transformed into something neither could have anticipated, a genuine partnership founded on mutual respect and shared purpose. 6 months after the battle in the canyon, they stood together on a new balcony overlooking a settlement where human and Shilar structures stood side by side. Emily wore a ceremonial robe that combined elements of both cultures' traditional designs. Beside her, Colin appeared in a formal uniform modified to accommodate Shilar aesthetic preferences. The xenobiologists have confirmed what we suspected, Emily said, breaking a comfortable silence between them. The Tsar were not native to this planet. They arrived only decades before humans made contact with my people. We were all invaders here. That creates common ground, Colin observed, his tactical mind automatically seeking advantages in new information. Shared identity as outsiders. Emily smiled slightly. Yes, though I prefer to think of us now as shared inhabitants rather than invaders. Colin turned to look at her directly, studying her face with the same intensity he'd once reserved for battlefield assessments. But now that gaze contained something new, a recognition that went beyond tactical evaluation. The official ceremony is unnecessary, he stated. We are already married by both legal systems. True, Emily acknowledged, but symbols matter, especially now. She hesitated, then added more softly, unless you object to renewing our vows under more voluntary circumstances. Colin was silent for several moments, processing something complex within his still-healing neural architecture. When he finally spoke, his voice contained a warmth that would have been impossible months before. I do not object. As they turned to enter the ceremonial hall, where representatives of both species waited to witness their chosen union rather than their forced one, Emily felt Colin's hand briefly touch hers. A small gesture, but significant, coming from a man whose conditioning had labeled physical contact without tactical purpose as unnecessary. She returned the gesture, their fingers momentarily interlacing. They had begun as reluctant symbols of a forced peace. Now they were something else entirely, pioneers of a genuine alliance, architects of a shared future neither could have imagined when they first stood together in that cold ceremonial hall as strangers and enemies. Ready? She asked. Colin nodded, his expression more human than it had been since before the program that had transformed him. Ready. Together they stepped toward to begin again. If you like this story, please click the hype button. This video deserves to be popular.